Religious education is an interdisciplinary field of study that's at the intersection of the disciplines of education on the one hand and theology and religious studies on the other. In this plenary, we bring together a leading international, interdisciplinary religious education scholar and bring him into dialogue with other established religious education scholars to discuss the use of media today from a religious education perspective. Our moderator is Dr. Leah Gunning-Francis. She is the Associate Dean for Contextual Education and Assistant Professor of Christian Education at Eden Theological Seminary in St. Louis. And in June, Leah will begin serving as the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of the Faculty at the Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. She's the author of a new book, Ferguson and Faith, Sparking Leadership and Awakening Community, published by Chalice Press, which discusses some of the roles of St. Louis area clergy and congregations and the part that they played in the aftermath of the tragic shooting of Michael Brown by a police officer in August 2014. Through her research, teaching, pastoral leadership, and community involvement, Leah has explored and reflected on various ways in which Christian education can provide a process for transformation to occur. We welcome Leah Gunning-Francis.
Thank you, Bud, and good morning. Welcome to Plenary 3 on Media and Imagination, where we hope that you will find the information shared today very insightful, creative, and pique your imagination in ways that perhaps it has not been piqued before. Our process for this morning is we will have our presenter give his presentation, and then he would like for us to take a buzz break. So if you want to sit and go zzz, that's fine. But if you'd like to do a little more than that, I encourage you to take just about 5 minutes to talk with your neighbor about what you've heard and some of the thoughts that are immediately coming to your mind. After our buzz break, I will reconvene us and introduce our 2 respondents, where they will offer just some very brief remarks, and then we'll open it up to questions from the floor. This morning, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Graham Rossiter. Dr. Rossiter has become a household name in Australia among those involved in religious education. His insights and ideas are also acclaimed throughout the English-speaking world. Rossiter has also conducted youth retreats and is currently the principal supervisor for a study of the views of students and teachers on retreats in secondary schools in 7 Australian Catholic dioceses. Dr. Rossiter is Professor of Moral and Religious Education at Australian Catholic University's Strathfield campus in Sydney. His most recent book, Reasons for Living, Christian Education and Young People's Search for Meaning, Identity, and Spirituality. Let us welcome Dr. Graham Rossiter.
Thank you very much, Leah. It is a delight to be here with you today, and I must say I am very indebted to Bud and to the people in the REA who have been most gracious and most welcoming. We felt very much at home. Thank you. A few preliminaries before addressing the topic. We have left on the seats for you a handout, and it has 4 things in it. Firstly, a little bit of the background, perhaps bias that I bring to this topic, and also some of the issues that are being faced by Catholic school religious educators in Australia. That may help fill background in a little. Secondly, there are a few thoughts on how I think this topic relates to the theme of the conference, religious imagination. Thirdly, there are 4 web addresses there, and if you wish, you can have a look at those, where the topic that I'm talking about is covered in much, much more detail in master's units that we teach in Sydney. And I thought it may be even of some interest for you to see the sorts of things that we have done across those units. And there's one more website to add, which will have these 2 presentations on if people would like to make use of any of it.
While he's changing that, we just added the handout to Sketch to this session, so if you weren't able to get a print one, it's in the, if you look for a little blue link that says handout in Sketch, it's also there.
The topic I want to address has to do with the way that religion has changed its presence in the culture. And we have people talking about the decline of the prominence of religion in social life. And they've used terms like secularisation, deinstitutionalisation, and a whole lot of others, all constructs to help make some sense of this secularisation. What I'm going to suggest here is that perhaps another way of looking at this may also make a helpful contribution, and that is that the complex of media, advertising, marketing, commerce, consumer production, and even competitive capitalism may well form a web or a complex that has a shaping influence on people's imaginations of what life should be about. So that's the thing that I want to try to address. It could well be that a lot of people today are not really secularised. They may well be very religious. It's just that it's a new religion. It's a consumerist religion. So it's a thesis that is controversial, that you may not agree with, but I think it's one that warrants some attention. So I want to have a look at this in 4 parts. Firstly, I'd like to have a look at some of the literature and research related to religion, media, secularisation and marketing, because this is a background, I think, for making sense of this case. Secondly, and this may seem a little unusual, I'd like to report on a pedagogy we have used with graduate students that compares and contrasts medieval Christianity with contemporary consumerist lifestyle. You might say, why on earth would you make that sort of comparison? Well, I'll explain later. It's because both of these movements, if you call them that, at very different times in history, both gave and now give a very prominent place to imagery, iconography, and how this helps people in their construction of meaning and purpose. The third part will use that as a catalyst for saying just a few words about how does contemporary branding and consumerism affect people's imaginations of what life should be. And then in the fourth part, I'd like to have a look at, well, what do we do about this as religious educators? What is a response that we might make to this situation? So the first part, the person who seemed to start the discussion about how media might have a shaping influence on what people think came with the studies of Marshall McLuhan. And he is interesting because he focused very much only on television. He saw this as the great educator, so much so that he had no regard at all for school. He said children interrupt their education each day to go to school. And I think that his comment about the primary school system is worth reading. The school system, custodian of a print culture, has no place for the rugged individual. It is indeed the homogenising hopper into which we toss our integral tots for processing. So I think you can see that's the view that he had there. Now, in the remaining examples of literature that I want to have a look at, this is just a selection. This is a vast field, and I've just picked a few that I think are representative, some of which you may already know a lot about, but simply to build up the big picture here that will help us understand the rise of consumerist religion. After McLuhan, a number of people in the churches tried to respond by saying, how can we make use of McLuhan's ideas about media for educative purposes in the church or in religion? And it's interesting that this goes back actually to the late 19th century when cinematography first emerged. The Christian churches were very much involved in the early stages there, and they produced lots of films about Bible heroes, the life of Christ and so on. And that is another interesting area to go into, just in terms of the effects that involvement had on interpretation of Scripture. But the example that I want to have a look at here is Pierre Babin, who was a French Catholic scholar. And in 1970 he published this book called The Audiovisual Man. And what he proposed there is that if religious educators do not take into account the way that people today process things in an audiovisual fashion, that they won't really make much sense. They won't really communicate. He was very interested in what he called the audiovisual montage as an item that you would use in religious education. And when he was in Australia in 1977 and 1988, I was asked to be his personal minder. Now, I could tell some very interesting stories there, but the only point I wanted to make was in the workshops where, in groups, we were preparing our colour slides for our audiovisual montage, I went in with what I thought were my 5 best slides. And Pierre picked them up and he looked at them and he dropped them and he said, postcards. So you can see my work wasn't very good then, and I'm still trying to improve. The next person I want to refer to is not so much in the media area, but in the understanding of secularisation. And I think Harvey Cox, in his books, was one of the first to look into secularisation in other than a deficit model or not in an anti-religious model, to make more sense of it. And his other book, that came a little later, was interesting because he talked about the way the culture proposes individuality and freedom as these great major themes, but at the same time they seduce people away from that individuality. So he had this idea of the seductive power of what was happening in the culture that can then be manipulative. And of course his other work on popular piety and the people's religion and so on. The next person I want to draw attention to, I think was significant. He was a McLuhanist, and this was William Coons. And his interest was the possibility that in the media, people were now finding the stories that were being produced in the media were becoming the principal spiritual and moral reference points for people. It's one of the first to talk about that. And he suggested that it was not just television. That was McLuhan. He suggested that it was what he called the entertainment milieu, and that this functioned like a religious milieu, and that the role of the priest was being taken over by the talk show host, that morality was being influenced by the morality of so many of the sitcoms and dramas and that sort of thing. I think the thesis of this talk really does follow up what William Koons was suggesting. I think he was also remarkably prescient in terms of where he thought things might be going. Now, he wrote this in 1969, and I'd just like to read for you a couple of comments that he made. Firstly, about the role of the church in relation to the entertainment media. The church could be a vital force in society for creating a critical awareness of the entertainment milieu, using the media themselves to comment on the nature and the meaning of the media, and talking about analysis of themes and techniques. On the critical role of educators, promoting the kind of self-awareness so imperative today, as the electronic media become increasingly potent in shaping society, someone should be capable of maintaining the critical distance necessary for judging the moral and the aesthetic directions which people take as a result. Then about morality. Morality should be transformed from a sensitivity to sin and virtue to a large sensitivity to freedom. In the electronic media, new kinds of freedom become available, but too often at the cost of new forms of manipulation. I think that in his time, probably the term cultural postmodernity would not have been used, but here you had someone who was able to talk about that natural level of uncertainty that seems to be there in so many forms of spiritual and personal knowledge. So he said, the entertainment milieu has transformed the ways in which we believe and are capable of believing. An absolute kind of belief, as well as belief in absolutes, becomes increasingly difficult as the entertainment milieu trains people to believe tentatively and with elasticity. In the future, a total belief may be virtually impossible and similarly undesirable. Perhaps the only viable belief in God will be riddled with doubt and constantly shifting with the fluctuations of what he called the reality-fantasy ratios created by the entertainment milieu. So I think you can see there something quite prescient. Now, some of the people at the time thought that McLuhan's focus was too narrow. It was on the medium itself, and here you had a focus on the entertainment milieu, but you had people like the Welsh sociologist Raymond Williams, who said if you want to understand the influence of the media, it must be in a much larger context. In other words, it's not just the media. It's media plus advertising, plus marketing, plus consumerism, plus commerce, plus competitive capitalism. Williams thought that there were too many people who were simply passive consumers of culture, and that they needed to be informed critically so that they became more creative agents in the manufacture of new culture. And he used this term cultural agency to describe that. He wrote a treatise on television in 1974, and you can download that, and if you read it you think this man certainly was way ahead of his time in interpreting so much of what has happened in the unfolding of television. Now, in the United States, Michael Warren, a member of this association, popularised Williams's views, and also he worked on Foucault as well and brought that in. And both he and Raymond Williams pointed out that if you don't understand culture as a social construct, that people actually put it together, then you take it for granted. It is presumed, it remains invisible, and it cannot be critiqued. And so both of these people said that you need to bring so much of the potential influences in the culture out into the open where they can be critically evaluated. It was Michael Warren who, in my view anyway, first used this phrase, media orchestrated imaginations of life, and that these need to be scrutinised. And I think you can see that in both of these people, they were quite different from Marshall McLuhan in seeing that education, schooling, adult religious education had a vital role for critiquing the way that cultural meanings might have a shaping influence on the way people think and behave and so on. We'll come back to that a little later. I just tossed in a four-worder from probably the most significant religious educator in Australia, Brian Hill, who comes from an evangelical tradition, but he never wastes words, and so he summed it up in 4 words. He thought that education needed to be an interrogation of one's cultural conditioning. It's like a mouthful, but I think you can see that this is part of a tradition of critical religious education. I think it's also valuable here to mention the voice of Neil Postman, who was concerned about the way that television in particular trivialised so many of our public discourses. Like the O.J. Simpson trial became a media event and so on. And so it affected journalism, the law, and so many things like that. And I think that his other difference from McLuhan was that there was a critical role for education. And I still quote his 1969 comment in that book, Teaching as a Subversive Activity, where he said about schooling, all kids are born with an inbuilt crap detector. And the role of educators is to sharpen and refine that instrument. And I think that sums up a lot of what we need to be doing. I believe that if he were still alive, his next book would not be Amusing Ourselves to Death. He would be looking at the social media, and the title of his book would be Distracting Ourselves to Death. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time now just sampling the literature in the area of marketing and advertising. And I want to look at 3 bits. The first one is just the general literature of marketing. What does that have to say that might be relevant to our topic? Secondly, the people who wanted to use marketing and advertising strategies to advance the church. In other words, how to sell the church. There is another whole area here of religious television and television evangelism that we cannot really look at today, but that's another area. And then the third one is interesting. It's where some marketing people have studied religion, particularly religious cults, because they thought they might learn something about the way these cults have a power over people, loyalty and fidelity. If we could transfer that to brands, they might turn their clients into cult followers. So let's have a look at these 3 areas. The first one is a book that came out recently by Jonah Sachs, and it was called The Story Wars. And what he was getting at here is that he felt that the very best and most successful advertising was the advertising that tapped beneath the surface into the myths, the imaginations and the stories that were driving the culture, or that were very important in culture at the time. And he saw the marketers as contemporary myth makers and myth developers, and he talked about the struggle for whose story is going to win, and that's why he called the thing the Story Wars. And in that he talks about an example that makes you realise the marketing psychologists had summed all this up 40 years earlier. he looked at the work at Edward Louis Bernays. In addition to his having great longevity, he was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the son of Anna Freud Bernays. Anyway, his job was to sell cigarettes. And he thought, what we've got to do is get the women smoking, because up until the 1920s, there were apparently, according to him, not large numbers of women who smoked. In some places, women smoking in public was illegal, or at least strongly frowned upon. So what he wanted to do was somehow tap in the idea of women smoking into some of the major movements in myths and stories about women's rights. Remember, the 1920s, there was still a flow-on from the period of the suffragettes, who had done wonderful work in getting the vote for women in the US and in the United Kingdom, and so on. So what he decided to do was get a group of reasonably attractive young women and put them in the Women's Protest March on Easter Sunday 1929. And then at the appropriate moment, where they had all of the newspaper cameramen lined up, they stopped, pulled out Lucky Strikes and lit up and smoked in public. And this was reported in the New York Times as "Group of girls puff at cigarettes as a gesture of freedom." Now, what word do you think they used for cigarettes in those newspaper stories? They didn't call them cigarettes. What do you think they called them? They called them torches of freedom. And so they were tapping into this fundamental, strong myth that there was a need for women's rights. It provided women with a ritual. If they lit up, they were tapping into this expression of believe in yourself, and so on. And it turned out to be a very successful marketing campaign. Now, I want to pause here and say something about a construct that Marisa and I have found to be very useful in getting into this topic, and it's the film and literature studies concept of mise-en-scène. Now, some of you may know about it, but they teach this to senior high school students in English in Australia. And while I may not do justice to the film study scholars, just to say a little bit about it, you might define it as follows. It's like the subliminal background, the unwritten storyline, the myths, you could say the imaginations that need to be acknowledged before you can understand the story that's going on. Another way of putting it is the mise-en-scène has visual clues or cues that call up, even subliminally, assumptions that you need to make before you can follow the story. It's the unarticulated values and perspective that need to be in place if you want to make sense of the story. Now, the point that I'm trying to make here is that it may well be that it's not this piece of advertising creating an emotional link between you and that product. It could be that the unwritten storyline about consumerism, about individuality, about freedom, about buying name brands and so on, that unwritten storyline is what is being subtly insinuated. In other words, it's not what's happening at the surface, it's what's happening beneath the surface that counts. Now, just to illustrate this, the Jeep ads in Australia have been particularly successful. They have increased sales so much. And I want to show you two examples here because they illustrate this idea of what's the Jeep mise-en-scène. Because if you don't understand that, you won't understand this advertisement. And if you think of yourself as the marketer and the advertiser, you've got Jeeps, these rugged World War II things that come from that tradition. Then they became into the man's vehicle, those who go hunting, fishing and shooting. So they want to turn that image into something that's family-friendly, that's eco-friendly, that's educational, that will appeal to grandmas as well as to little kids. This is what they set out to do. Now, there have been dozens of these. I don't know if any of these have appeared in the United States, but they've been particularly successful. So I'd just like you to have a look at two of them. Only take a minute. And I'd like you to work out what's the underlying story, the myths that they're tapping into that you need to bring to mind before you make sense of the story.
What a Jeep, you think? Oh, this is fun.
So I won't show you the last part, but can you see here that there are so many layers to the mise-en-scène of the Jeep? Why do you think they had grandsons that they were talking about? Why didn't they talk about their sons? Some of the students have suggested this is the new generation of the grandsons, so new generation of Jeep. Then, talking about grandsons, how many grandsons do you know would send their grandmother a postcard? The son might. So here's a remarkably sensitive grandson. What's the mise-en-scène? Nice kids drive Jeeps. Now, in addition to the grandmother appeal, they also appeal to the children. So the next ad is a primary school class where on Monday the children have to come out and show something that tells about their adventures during the weekend.
This is Shanghai and is my new best friend. Next. This is a carousel and I found it on a very remote beach called Raffles Bluff where we went for the weekend. My brother also found one. They must have been cheap.
So I think you can see even the kids know that Jeep has now become associated with adventure, going to places where nobody else goes. It's educational, it's family friendly, and this is, it's been responded to by some of the other car companies who now have their anti-Jeep children ads. So I won't need to go into it, but it turns out that the views of children do have an impact on what cars are bought. The psychologists know this. Now, the next idea about mise-en-scène, which is a very prominent one in marketing and advertising, is that the mythology that's the mise-en-scène is called the inadequacy or deficiency marketing. In other words, you're born with a natural congenital deficiency, and the only way you're going to overcome that is to buy the right stuff that will help you make the grade. And of course, this particular example also tosses in a little bit of erotic and sexual innuendo, which the advertisers know always helps as well. I think that this also taps into something deeper here, that people are born with a natural personal identity deficiency. And I think that there's some truth in this, that, you know, we're born human, but we become persons through a lot of social interaction. And our sense of personal identity often depends on the way we are treated by family, friends, and so on. So there's something in that. Now, the next area of marketing, how religion should be marketed. And this is a book by Phil Cook, and he argues that brands are really like religions. And the idea of promoting the church is, how do you sell religion as a brand? And these are some comments I'd like to read from his book that show this up. He considered that commercial branding functioned like a religion. It created a receptive resonance in consumers by propagating the following feelings: sense of belonging, being part of a select community, experiencing collective rituals, and having a shared belief system. In many ways, corporate America is subtly attempting to replace religion with branding, at least in the West. Today, brands are the tool for defining our place in the culture, and they have given our capitalist society markers or reference points for determining who we are, where we belong, and our status in relation to others. Branding helps us express ourselves to the greater community of believers. Then he said, brand communicates ideas, values, and standards. What was expressed a generation ago through religious affiliation is now communicated through what we wear, the car we drive, the pen that sits in our pockets. To a secular culture, brands and religions have merged. Savvy marketers and advertisers have tapped into our global human aspirations for a sense of belonging, value, meaning, and worship, and have turned ordinary, everyday products into brands, and eventually brands into religions. In a secular society, brands are worshipped as gods. We value them, express loyalty to them, and associate with others of like-minded belief. Now, the final, I'd like also to say something about Hanlon's book, Primal Code, and he suggests that these are the characteristics of the successful brands, that they have their creation stories, they have their creeds, like just do it. Have your tradition but live for now, that's the Pepsi one. The Jeep one is don't hold back, all of these slogans. The icons like the Nike swoosh and the McDonald's end, they're sort of non-verbal symbols that kids, most people pick up quickly. Pagans and non-believers, those who don't buy this brand are the pagans. The iPhone and the Android, the PC and the Mac, Pepsi, Coke, it's that sort of division. The distinctive in-group lingo that helps with group identification. And finally, the cult of the leader, the Steve Jobs and the mystique of Apple and that sort of thing. They capitalise a lot on that. And then the same with celebrity endorsements. Now, what can marketing learn from religion? And I found this an interesting book called The Culting of Brands, where Douglas Atkin did research with religious cults to see what he could find out about the way people believed and why they were so faithful and committed to their cult. What can we learn from that to help our advertising? So that covers the first part of what I wanted to look at. And now, briefly, the second part, well, the second and third and fourth part. I mentioned before that the second part is going to seem initially a bit unusual. Why would you look specifically at medieval Christianity? That is, pre-Renaissance, pre-Reformation, pre-Enlightenment. Why look at that and contrast that with contemporary consumerist lifestyle? Firstly, I want to talk about this. I'm reporting just a pedagogy that we have used with our graduate students to try to get them involved in this topic, to think about it critically. And even the two photographs there are an interesting starting point. The top one, for those of you who don't know Latin, it means the house of God and the gate of heaven. And this summarised the whole economy of salvation for medieval Christians. That if you followed what the church wanted you to do, and the church was very, very dominant, and you keep the rules, and with the help of Jesus and Mary and the saints, you'll save your soul. And in going ahead with this comparison between medieval Christianity and contemporary lifestyle, I think that you may be able to do something for other periods of Christian spirituality, and I think it could also be done for Judaism, Islam and so on, but I just don't have the knowledge to be able to do that. This one works well as a pedagogy. I don't know how it might work with other religious traditions, and I'd be very interested in talking with people from other traditions about how they might come to this same question. The diagram underneath, you see the word OMG. This is oh my, short for oh my God, which is now a public brand with a patent. And we find that there are lots of children, say, coming into Catholic schools in Australia. They may be Catholic nominally, and they have never heard the word God talked about seriously in their own home. They may have seen it on television. More likely, it would be something like this. One parent might say, "Oh my God, the Royals have won the World Series." So, in a sense, the word "oh my God," there's been a migration of meaning. It's now a very secular term. If you look up Google and you look for "oh my God, religion," you get so many million hits. If you look up "oh my God, experience, exhilaration," or whatever it is, you get many, many more. So it's now like a secular word. I would like to read to you the sort of justification for looking at contrasting these two. While in two very different cultures at distinct periods of history, both medieval Christianity and contemporary consumerist lifestyle, I think lifestyle is a more realistic word here, both have been dominated by a universal visual iconography that mediated powerful cultural sources of meaning and value. These were like the pillars that structured a unified social reality for the people at the time, shaping their views of meaning and purpose to life. The dominant cultural imagery in both situations conditioned the perceived underlying narrative or mise-en-scène for life. And as I said, it's a pedagogy that I've tried to illustrate. And so with my master's students, we had 21 different items or categories from medieval Christianity, and they then had to look for imagery and iconography that compared the two. Sometimes there might be a similar function, sometimes the function would be very, very different. Like who were the saints in medieval Christianity? Who are the saints in consumerist culture? So you can see it is just, in some ways, a fun activity, or did prove to be for some of the students, for making all of these sorts of comparisons. Now, we don't have time to go into what they found out, but I just like to look at three bits. The first one is how the medieval people built up their understanding of what the Christian life meant, often through the art and statuary and architecture of their churches and cathedrals. And just to show you a little bit of this, an example. The biblical and gospel events often portrayed on the walls of the churches and cathedrals. And you would look at these and say, well, they're very narrative, they're very descriptive, but they were more than that. They were like icons where these mainly illiterate people reconnected with these saving events in history. You see, the paintings and the stained glass windows were like the first drive-ins or the first PowerPoints. You know, they were very instructional and fitted in with all the other ways that the faith was communicated to people. But just to show you that sometimes it got more complicated than that. Often the paintings would tie in with ritual practice, like painting of the baptism of Jesus with the baptismal font. Another way of creating the link between people and the saving events was here you have the Madonna and Child painted in a local Italian landscape where the locals would know that's their town or their city. So you can see there was a way of connecting there. Then a lot of the paintings had the local saints who were put back into these saving events. And here you have the coronation of Mary with St. George with the sword, and St. Terence, who was a local boy, and he was one of the local saints for this region, and so on. The next one shows you that it gets even more complicated when the political powers become involved and they insert themselves into the religious mise-en-scène for their purposes. This is a 1395 painting of the English King Richard II, who was something of a tyrant. When this was painted, probably with his approval, he was a young man, but he's represented here as the child king because he was most famous for quelling the peasants' revolt when he was 12 years old. And there, of course, in the picture on the left is John the Baptist. That was his patron. Then you have beside him St. Edward the Confessor and St. Edmund the Martyr. Now, why were they there? These three people are presenting Richard II to the Madonna and the Child. Now, why are they there? Look on their heads and you'll see they have crowns. Both Edward and Edmund were English kings. So can you see that this is highly political? This is the Saint Kings presenting Richard to the Madonna and Child. It's a reinforcement of the divine right of kings. And don't any of you peasants out there disagree with this. But there are even more layers to this. If you look on Richard's chest, there's a pendant with the white hart or the white stag on it. And you might think, well, that's pretty harmless, but it wasn't. The white stag was the symbol that all of his private mercenary army had emblazoned on their shields or whatever it was. It was like the equivalent of the SS, the Nazi SS. And they were pretty brutal in opposing his enemies or anyone else who got out of line. But if you look in the right-hand side of the diptych, you see that one of the angels is carrying Richard's flag. What does that say? Then if you look further, you can see all of the angels have got the white heart on their left shoulder. It's like putting an SS insignia on all the angels. So this is just one example of the sort of complexity, both political and religious, that was apparent in a lot of the art at the time. Now, from there, if you contrast that imagery with what we know, I don't think there's any need to talk about contemporary imagery because we have enough of that. But I thought it would be worth having a quick look at what the students came up with in two areas. One was where they contrasted pilgrimage, and the other one is where they contrasted scriptures. So, pilgrimage. Sorry, let's go back to that. It contrasts the Canterbury pilgrimage with a pilgrimage to your nearest designer outlet mall. Where since the 12th century you still had people performing this pilgrimage, I think, and did it last year. Well, a sort of pilgrimage. Now the designer outlet mall, just see how many religious words come up in this. Just as you have the, where to go in the world, you need to know where to go with regard to the big brands. You have Pilgrim, All Saints, St. John. My favourite is True Religion. The thing is that the pilgrimage to the designer mall is something for the whole family. Look at that: love, fashion, adore, life. See all the religious words coming in. It's in England more so perhaps than here. It's a day out for the family. It's like going to church. There's the children's playground as well as designer shops for the kids, the teenagers and the adults. The findings that they had for Scripture. The students in looking at this, first of all pointed out, down the left-hand side are just the traditional Hebrew and Christian scriptures. On the right they pointed out that in addition to books and newspapers and films and so on, that people are now creating their own personal scriptures through blogs, through internet sites, through Twitter and so on. Some of the students pointed out that people are wearing their scriptures through the comments that are on their own T-shirts. Stop and think. I think that would be the one that Jesus would have had. Some of the students have also pointed out that this has gone even further, where people are putting their own scriptures on their own body through tattoos and piercing and so on, and they found some exotic ones that Now, this is the sense that the students made of this investigation. See, first of all, by looking at medieval Christianity, they had to look at some religion and try to interpret it in psychological terms. Then they had to look at what's happening in consumerist culture and try to interpret that in religious terms. So here are their summaries of the two mise-en-scènes, one for medieval Christianity, one for contemporary consumerism. Now, these are summaries. Any sort of diagrams have natural limitations, but I think you may see that there is a sense of reality in them, and also I think they can be a bit confronting. Now, with the traditional, or with medieval Christianity, the overarching authority, the source of authenticity, the sense of absolute certainty to this faith came through God, and from God through the church, the Bible and religious culture. This was then internalised, often because they thought this is God's will, or I need to be obedient, and in lots of cases it was simply fear. If we don't do this, we'll go to hell. And how this figured in those three elements, their meanings, their sense of identity, and their spirituality. Their religious meanings were very authoritative. They internalised the whole system of meanings. It was so difficult to think outside that box. They accepted it often without question, and it was supported by a very prominent religious culture. In terms of spirituality, the transcendence of God was all important. There was systematic worship and prayer, religious practices. Their meaning and purpose in life was mainly religious, and it had a lot of institutional support. Their personal identity, the great thing about this was you had a cosmic significance because you were loved by God as an individual. Very powerful affirmation. But a strong religious identification was also prominent. if you then look at how did this inform their experience, their behaviour, their moral values, in other words, how do they live these religious meanings out? Where's it going? It's the ultimate purpose and goal for life was to go to heaven and be with God. So it was very simple. It was like, life here will be pretty tough. You won't last too long, but if you keep the rules, be a good Christian, you'll get to heaven and you'll be happy forever after. And now, I don't think that many Christians today would see this as a really adequate understanding of their mise-en-scène for Christianity, but that's what the students felt was the picture that emerged from their look at medieval Christianity. Now, what about contemporary consumerist lifestyle? What's the overarching authority here? What's the source of authenticity? Where does the sense of certainty come from? From God? No, it's embedded in the self. In other words, people are deciding what they're going to believe in, what they think is ultimate truth. They sense this is part of their freedom and their individuality, and it is supported by cultural meanings from a society that's preoccupied with lifestyle, looks, happiness, individuality, and authentic experience. This underpins and resources their meaning, identity, and spirituality, and it motivates, through Michael Warren's idea of media-orchestrated imaginations of what life should be like. And so this will affect their personal meanings, helps them make sense of life, their spirituality. I don't know if spirituality is a word that a lot of secular people would use, but if you think that the way they are living has values of some sort, these implied values could be regarded as a type of implied spirituality. And their personal identity, self-definition as a consumer. The other thing I'd like to mention here is that this is often underpinned by the great play of existentialism, the here and now that Beyonce talks about in her Pepsi ad. And it's all about buzz experiences. And as you have more buzz experiences, you need higher voltage ones to make you feel good. It's all about instant feel-good, excitement, and these serve as a type of self-affirmation for people's identity in the quest for individuality and happiness. And so far, if you look at that, so well, that's interesting. But what about God and what about religion? They're not there at all. Are they there at all? And the view of, this came particularly from Philip Hughes, who did a lot of research with young people in Australia. He said they're there, but they're up in the sky, along with astrology, psychology and sociology. These are the things that you can't be sure of, and he said that they are often, now this is a bit of a mouthful, but he said that God and religion and so on, for many of the consumers, it's regarded as an optional, potentially useful background resource infrastructure. Sounds awful, but I think you see what he's getting at. And that there's a natural uncertainty. You can never really trust religion or psychology or astrology because there's so much natural uncertainty to it. So if this then affects their view of life and so on, are they going towards heaven? Yes, they are, but it's consumer heaven. You don't have to wait, just visit your local mall. Now, I think that these two summaries can be a bit confronting, but I sense from the students that there's a sense of reality in them. I think you'd look at both of them and say, I'm not happy with either of those. And you might want to think, well, what would be a way of describing the mise-en-scène that we think is authentically religious, authentically human? Now, the third part, and I'm getting very close to finishing, finish up very quickly. The students' study of comparisons between medieval Christianity and contemporary lifestyle was a catalyst for looking very critically at how consumerist culture insinuates itself into our thinking and imagination. And I want to say just a little bit about this, but this being Atlanta, this being the home of the great iconic Coca-Cola, I couldn't resist putting in a little bit on this. I have a very long documentary on the whole Coca-Cola story that is on the websites that we've talked about before, but this is just a fun thing to point out how Coca-Cola changed the image of Christmas.
It was during this period that an American brand discovered that a successful advertising campaign could even change the icons of a culture.
In 1931, Haddon Sundblom painted a picture of Santa Claus drinking Coca-Cola. And Santa Claus, up until that point, has often been dressed in yellow or green, and he was kind of skinny and gaunt. Well, from now on, he was dressed in Coca-Cola red, and he was this big, fat, jolly guy, and he loved Coca-Cola.
The marketing department's decision to commission a friendly and cuddly Santa Claus in red and white was a triumph.
It was a brilliant ad campaign. So that when I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, I thought that Santa Claus wanted Coca-Cola. You know, that was his favorite thing.
The campaign ran every Christmas for more than 30 years and changed the world's perception of Father Christmas.
These questions I won't really have time to talk about. They're taken up in more detail in the web material that I've left for you to have a look at. But it's a way of trying to understand how we've changed from a culture where only the rich and nobility had bespoke or handmade special brand things. But these days, this is offered to all. I saw an advertisement on television the other night here, and it said, "You don't have to be a king to be treated like a king." And so you have this whole imagery there. And so there are questions like, well, why do people buy designer goods anyway? What's the psychology, the cachet, the status, and so on? And then you have to ask, well, what's wrong with that in any case? See, it's not so much consumption, it's ultimately the question of balance. And if people are obsessed with brands, if it affects their family, their discretionary use of income and so on, that's when these things become issues. So this part of the follow-up text to what I'm talking about goes into all of these into these questions in a lot more detail. We don't have time for that now. Finally, I wanted to look briefly at what we've touched on already, and that is a critical, inquiring pedagogy for religious education. And I look at it this way, that any good religious education should have three elements: to give the people concerned good access to their own religious tradition. Secondly, they know something about the other religious traditions in the culture, the whole interfaith, interreligious area. And thirdly, how can they learn skills in identifying, interpreting, and evaluating the spiritual and moral issues that they encounter in life? In other words, with young people, can we help them chart their way more meaningfully through the complex maze of contemporary culture? And I think that whether the children are religious or not, I think that third element really needs to be there. And I would argue that it needs greater prominence. In the Catholic religion curricula that we deal with in Australia, they're basically all about telling the kids about Catholicism. And I don't think that ever has been or ever will be an adequate or a sufficient religious or spiritual education. Now, I won't go into this in great detail, but I believe that all good religious education throughout history has always had this element there. Some would say that it goes right back to the Christian scriptures, where you have the pedagogy of Jesus, who is not so much a highly religious figure, but someone deeply concerned about the social situation of the little people. calling people to pay attention to what's going on, standing up for them with a fidelity that eventually got him executed. And I think that's true. But it doesn't stop there. Where did Jesus get this from? He was Jewish to the core. And I thought what he's doing is just following in the footsteps of the great prophets of the Hebrew Scriptures. I remember the first time my eyes were opened to the study of the Hebrew Bible. We attended some lectures by Bruce Vorter. And when he talked about what the prophets were doing for the people of Israel, I think now it's no different from what we're trying to talk about here with a really critical pedagogy. And I remember the book that he had on the Hebrew prophets was called The Conscience of Israel. And I thought that summed up very much what he was about there. Now, finally, I'd just like to suggest what does this mean for the Religious Education Association? And from the little that I know, it appeared to me that, going back to that conference in 1903, that from there on, ever since, there's never been an absence of some critical, evaluative aspect to talk about religious education in this association. I remember one of Dewey's quotations. He said, "A good education is one that gives people the information and the courage to change their mind." So I think that's that evaluative perspective. And I think if you looked at the journal and if you look at the scholars who've been part of this association, I just picked two at random. I think that the massive literature in this journal has always had a critical evaluative element to it. And I think that needs to be played up more these days. And Gabriel would just be an example of many who are critical. Gabriel, I don't think there's anything you've written that's ever lacked some sort of evaluative dimension to it. I think I might be right there. And so I would think that that's something that we need to value in the tradition of an association like this, and I would suggest give it more emphasis. I wanted to finish with a cartoon by Australian cartoonist Lunig. He did this in 1984, that's 30 odd years ago, and it's called the Understandoscope. And I think this is like an icon of what religious educators, or one of their tasks, is to help young people develop their own understandoscopes so that they can try to make much more sense of what's happening in the culture and become more critical and more evaluative of often the seductive and manipulative influences that may be there. And that they may come to think about what's the balance in all of this. Now, I'd like to stop there, but just before I stop and get the other members of the panel up, I'd like you to note that on the handout, the very first web address of the four, if you just change the last word, 646 in the number, to REA.html, you'll get both of these presentations, the files if you want to look at them, and also reference to another unit that I forgot to put in the original. So thank you very much. I look forward to discussing hopefully some of the issues that have come out of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Graham. We just want to take about 2 minutes for you all to have some conversations with your neighbor about what you've heard and offer a bit of reflection, and invite our respondents to come to the stage. In the interest of time, we're going to move on to allow our respondents just to offer some very brief remarks. We welcome Marisa Crawford and Katherine Turpin, whose bios you'll find in your packets. Marisa has taught English and religion in Kensington, Sydney for many years and has authored several books with Grant. So Marisa, we ask you to come first, and then Katherine, if you would come next. Thank you.
Actually, considering the little time we have left, I thought I might share just one of my experiences that really is quite iconographic and draws a number of these elements together. I have taught for 45 years school from year 7 to 12, so 12-year-olds to about 18-year-olds. This was quite an experience for me because it encapsulated many of the things that Graham was talking about. This was the class of year 7th in Australia, girls about 12. And coming up to Easter, their task was to do something about the Easter liturgy, but more specifically to write about 250 words about the significance of Easter, but also to do an imaginative tableau or a play or a speech or whatever about the Triduum. Now, I always have to be reminded what the Triduum is, but I'm sure that Catholic scholars will tell me the 3 significant days leading to Easter. There was one young lass who was the epitome of what you'd call a Catholic girl. She was 12, she had lovely pigtails in bunches. In Australia, you know, we all wear uniforms, so they all look quite pristine and lovely. Her imaginative portrayal of the Triduum was to do a most intricate petty point with images of those 3 days. Now, for most of you who don't know what petty point is about, it is the finest kind of stitching, and she did this image of, I think it's Good Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or Holy Thursday, it doesn't matter. It was immaculate. It would have taken her hours. It's like tapestry on roids. So this child put a lot of time in this. She got full marks. A couple of months later, I had the same class, and I was waiting for them to return from having an inoculation. They were being inoculated against the papilloma virus. So they came in, and they're all holding their arms and doing this, except for this young lady, who came in and thought it in, and I said, "Oh, Ruby, you don't mind injections?" She said, "Oh, no, miss, I didn't have an injection because I'm not having sex till I'm in year 9. I still cough when I say that. I didn't say anything at the time, but afterwards I took her aside and I said, "Ruby, why are you planning to have sex in year 9? And she said, "Oh, because I'll have boobs by then." Now, to me, that signified everything that was wrong about the religious education that we are asked to teach, and the reality that this child had from all the information she was garnering from her friends, from her sisters, and there was a complete disconnect. We don't touch any of the really crucial and fraught questions that our students have. And I end the story by telling you that that young lady happened to be the prime scholar. I watched her graduate in year 12. She went on to university and she did law. And when I asked her about that, she said, "Yep, but that was the reality, you know. No use having sex with no tits." And when I asked her other questions, which can't possibly go into now, she said that as far as she was concerned, her whole religious education at that school was pretty well meaningless. She loved the rituals, she went to Mass, she thought that was fantastic, but in terms of really giving her life skills as a woman in this society, we really failed her. Okay, that's from me.
So very briefly, I just want to say thanks to Professor Rossiter. He's singing my song. Most of my work, I would say, in my early part of writing was trying to sort out, to use Emily Town's language, is there any way for there to be a counter memory to consumer culture? And what would that look like, given how fully sort of the colonization of religious imagination has been taken over by consumerist sort of lifestyle complex of institutions and narratives that Dr. Rossiter was explaining. As Del Deschamps said, who's a religious studies scholar who set out on the Sacred Santa to describe consumer religion, once we come to terms with that, we may discover just how religious we may be and how difficult it may be to be different than we are. And for me, I think one of the things that Professor Rossiter really pointed out was the importance of critical appraisal of this system and being able to name how it works, being able to recognize what's going on, how we're being recruited into other people's sort of profit schemes by being made to feel incomplete about ourselves, in need of certain products, those kinds of things. I guess the thing I would want to push a little bit on is that I think actually when people are aware of this, it doesn't make much difference. They have studies about this on body image with women, that they can pick apart media images and explain exactly how it is that what's being portrayed is realistic, not realistic, and yet if they read fashion magazines, they still feel bad about their body, right, at the same time. And that's a really complicated and interesting question to me. I think the kind of critical appraisal that Professor Rossiter was describing is really, really important. So I would never say that shouldn't happen, like being able to describe how this works and how we're implicated in it. But then I think for me the question has always been, so then where does counter memory come from? And what kind of immersive, embodied practice can be so important that our religious imagination doesn't continue to be completely colonized by this? And I do think, again, Dr. Towns' sense that this is daily work in undoing and reworking religious imagination is important to us here, because I do think in so many ways it's just part and parcel of what we have going on. I particularly was thinking about sort of the post-secular, if you want to use that language, studies on spirituality, where basically spirituality itself is in individual markets about the improvement of the self for greater health, well-being, balance, ability to cope with the stressors of the lifestyle that goes along with this. And so that doesn't seem to me like it's going to be able to counter the religious imagination, because it's just writing it and using it in certain ways. So that's one of the puzzles I have, is what does it take to build counter memory to sort of interact with this religious system that's a very demanding God and a pretty destructive one, looking ahead to environmental kind of issues in the ways that it portrays certain kind of people as desirable and other kinds of people as criminal and or useless to society, things like that. Thanks.
We have about 4 minutes for questions.
We have mics.
Yeah, we have mics. We have mic holders. One right there and one over here.
Thank you for your presentations and your responses. I'm Betty Tamposi from Fordham University, and my question has to do with the counter memory. And if we take as a premise that we're designed as humans to have this congenital hole in our hearts or hole in our needs and wants, and that, you know, filling that hole is sort of a fool's errand because it'll never be filled, except for the counter point to that may be that if we really look at human happiness or fulfillment as, and I just know this from my own experience, that when we are of use to others and not focused on the self, when there's self-forgetfulness, that's when we're really the happiest. And I'm wondering if there's any response to that.
I think you're quite right, and that Christian thing, he who loses his life will find it. That's where I think a Christian, a religious perspective can come in to critique these other things. And I think you're quite right. You can't be a really happy person by yourself. And so it's the whole social and community dimension that is often missing in a lot of the competitive consumerist.
I was thinking about, there was a study, a story that went viral not too long ago in the US about a group of high school boys from a Jesuit school, I think, who were volunteering as pallbearers at funerals for military veterans who were alienated from their families. So they were trained and then showed up regularly to carry caskets of people for whom they had no community. And over and over again, you could hear these young men say, this is part of the dignity and respect for the human person. We're all interconnected. We are family. This is, why we're doing this. It's really important. And for me, that's one of those little, what Jennifer Ayers would call sort of little move against destructiveness, right? It's an embodied practice of a different way of being connected that they've been recruited to and that they're finding meaningful, and that they can actually articulate a different story, right, than this one. Will it go on their college resume so they can sell themselves as good servants and a product of a Catholic school to get into a good Catholic college? Probably, right? So I don't think it's pure, but I do think it's important, I guess, as one of those sources of counter-memory.
One more question, please.
Graham, that was a tremendous presentation. Thank you very, very much. A question I have is with regard to the sacraments. I didn't notice a particular mention of the sacraments, and it seems to me that would be an important issue to raise. Could you speak to why that wasn't focused on?
It was a little random and haphazard process getting students to look at things, and I don't think that was excluded intentionally. It was just in my list. In fact, I think they were looking at particularly religious rituals, so they were things that were considered, but I didn't show them.
Let us thank Graham for his presentation once again. Thank you.